Scott, my friend, your work has shown that we actually produce, of course, we produce free radicals when UV hits us, and people think that UV, again, is the dangerous part of sunlight. But then you showed that that's 50% of the free radicals that are produced, but the other 50% is from blue light. So then what's happening when we use sunscreen?
Well, um, as we talked a little bit before, I mean, my point is that people are, I guess they're looking for a quick solution. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is that if you look at it, as you said, the reactive oxygen species generated by UV, an equal amount is generated by the blue and the visible cyan and those shorter wavelengths, which we call high energy photons, are high energy visible. And the point is that if you put the sunscreen on, sunscreen is designed to block the UV, but the function of the UV and the way the body's put together is that you get sunburn. You respond to give too much UV. That's your little message to tell you to go out and get out of the sun. And unfortunately, that's generated by the UVAs and the UVBs. It's not generated by the visible. So what ends up happening is that you get this a negative effect where you would spend, it's like I say, half the free radicals are generated in the UV, half in the visible. Well, if you block the UV, then that makes you want to stay outside longer because you're not getting sunburned. It's a good thing. I'm not arguing about that. You're not getting sunburned. But what you're doing is you're spending more time exposed to blue because you don't go in as quickly as you would if you would. The body's assuming that you're exposed to sunlight. Well, you just filtered out the part that the body uses as an alerting mechanism to tell you to get out, and you don't get out, so you spend more time exposed to blue, and that's why you're seeing an increase in basal cell carcinoma. Because if you do the optics models of the body, you find that the blue penetrates down into the basal cell level, and that's where most of its energy is dumped. So what you're literally doing is preventing people from getting a warning that they should get out of the sun. What they should do is they should treat sun with respect from the standpoint you wear a hat, you wear, have some clothes on. You don't sit out there and bake yourself because nobody, the nature was never intended. We were never intended to just sit there and bake. Go into the shade. You go into the shade, it acts just like a sunscreen. It absorbs the UV and the visible and from the leaves, or they're pulling that out of the spectrum. It increases the ratio of near infrared, so you end up with a better situation. And unfortunately, like I say, what's really a problem is that I looked at people with really dark skin, and they're having a woman that's trying to it, who has really dark skin has an issue that she's having enough trouble generating vitamin D because of her darker skin at higher latitudes. So she's struggling to generate the vitamin D she needs. But now she's buying, if you look at all the cosmetics that are out there, almost all of them have some level of SPF in it. She doesn't need SPF in any way, shape, or form. It's setting her at a disadvantage to compared to someone who has very light skin. And like I say, the real solution is that you end up going outside with some respect and hygiene, where you wear a hat. My grandpa was a dairy farmer, and every day he would he have his straw hat on, he'd have a pair of overalls on and a long sleeve cotton shirt. He'd work out throughout the day, and at lunchtime he'd go and he'd sit and eat his lunch in the shade. It's kind of common sense. And unfortunately, like I say, the problem is that when you introduce sunscreen to all the different makeups, so you're hitting some populations harder than others. And it's unfortunate because like I say, I mean, it's very difficult. We are all designed for the environment we're in. And but now we have this massive migrations and movement. People who have very dark skin are at higher latitudes, like Chicago, and struggling. People with like you and I, we go down to the equator and we end up like a French fry, if we're not careful. So, it's and then there's all the in between. And so that's my take on it. I'm actually a blue fan. I'm not anti-blue. It's just that you have to understand where it's going and what it's doing. And in a lot of ways, blue is good because it alerts you. But if you're getting it in too much, like anything, you can end up causing a problem. And uh, and why I'm so focused on trying to mimic the entire solar spectrum, because unfortunately, the same similar type situation exists in the with our LED lighting, in that blue. I mean, if I walk outside and I look up at the sky, it's a beautiful blue, at intensity levels that's way above anything we get within lighting. Um, Everybody likes to focus on the fact it's got a spike. Well, okay, make it broadband. It doesn't matter, you know. But when you're outside looking at the blue, the big difference is not the width of the spectral width of the blue. It's the fact that there's this huge tail that goes out into the infrared. So we are never exposed in nature to blue without an excess of near infrared. And it appears, based on the mechanisms we're finding now, that is because the infrared is generating higher levels of ATP production to offset the damage that could be done by the blue. You know, understand that the blue and the shorter wavelengths have enough energy to break a bond randomly. That's why our skin is essentially a sacrificial layer. Every 20 days, it's getting and dumping off and putting something new in, because it's taking on those higher energy photons that we have no idea where they what bond they're going to break. They can break, you know, a wide range of different um, molecular bonds in the body. So the body so the body has developed a lot of processes that then replenish that or repair that, associated with the longer wavelengths. And when you walk out and you go into the forest, everybody's big on forest walking. It's a great idea, because what happens? The sunlight, direct sunlight, is diffused out. Number one, most of the light's coming from different places, and they're not sitting under a beam of light. And the majority of that sunlight, about 80% of the visible portion, is absorbed by the trees, the leaves, and things around us. And the UV is strongly absorbed. But in the other way, the infrared is strongly reflected. If you look at some of Bob Fosbury's pictures of near infrared photography of trees and grass, it looks like we're walking through a snow globe. We got everything's reflecting. So what's it doing is it's taking the spectrum that's basically equal, and all of a sudden now the ratio in optical watts is in the infrared portion. So the near infrared to visible ratio in optical watts is changing as you walk out into the forest. And the trees are essentially taking out some of the higher energy photons, using them to generate photosynthesis, and letting us take up and use the longer wavelengths. So there's actually a real spectral shift that occurs. It's a benefit to everybody. So, and now when I first started doing this, I was looking at I'd been doing the visible portion for most of my career, and then I started listening to Hamlin and some of these other people and looking at what's going on with photobiomodulation. But so that kind of shifted out. Instead of looking at just visible, which is around 400 to 700 nanometers, now we started shifting out I started looking at the longer wavelengths, the near infrared, which in my book is somewhere around 650 out to about 1,000 or 1,100 nanometers. Okay. So that's what I call near infrared. Well, now we're expanding out and getting into the shortwave infrared and the mid infrared, and you're finding that there's all these different things. Every time we extend out what we look at as far as the solar spectrum, because the solar spectrum runs from 250 nanometers out to beyond 6,000 nanometers. So when people are talking about doing 850 or 1100, I'm not disagreeing with them, but it's not taking into account what nature is. Nature is a broadband thermal emitter, runs way out into the micron, 6, 10 microns. And what we're finding is each one of those bands or those different wavelength regions are doing something different. The UV is used to essentially generate vitamin D, but because it has enough energy to break the cholesterol, oxidize the cholesterol. You get into the visible, of course, we see, and that's a important function. And then you get into the near infrared, you start seeing that you're getting these effects on not just on the on hormones, on all these other events. And now we're going out into the shortwave infrared and the mid infrared, and we're finding that it perfectly aligns with a bunch of the activation energies needed for biological functions to occur. Coincidence? We don't know yet. But the bottom line is that, if you look at the body as being like a solar cell, the solar industry, they generate multi-layers of band gap materials so that they can absorb different portions of the solar spectrum. So what ends up mattering is that, you know, if you're looking at a silicon or a particular single junction solar cell, it has a band gap that will only accept a certain number of a certain energy range of photons in order to generate an electron. If you go and look at a multi-cell one, then you end up with, okay, well, these photons are good for this part, the silicon part. These photons are good for something in the infrared. And so they keep on expanding out the number of different regions or band gaps or junctions that they put into these solar cells, trying to get more and more efficiency. Body's already done it. The body is a solar cell. It is sitting there, and it takes UV photons. Everybody has no problem understanding the UV photons are absorbed by the body and do X. So that's one junction. You got the visible portion that our eyes use. That's another junction. If you look at the near infrared, there's all these different effects that we're getting from that Glenn's getting, where it's improving your eyesight and things of that nature. That's a different junction. And what ends up happening is that when you start looking at it at that viewpoint, you start switching the units of measure that you use. Everybody talks about watts per meter squared per nanometer in the solar spectrum. Has this nice little curve, peaks up in the visible, but that's not what the body's actually using. The body cares about what's not only the number of photons, but it also cares about the energy those photons are carrying, because depending on where that energy is, determines whether or not it gets absorbed, whether or not it gets reflected, whether or not it actually causes this reaction to occur faster. Each one of these bands are essentially stimulating some kind of a chemical reaction. And so all I guess I'm saying is we're slowly working our way out, adding the nature's been doing it, or our body's been doing it for millions of years, using all these different wavelengths, and they all matter for some kind of process within the body. And that's the part I think is the most fascinating thing about the whole thing.
Exactly. For example, just to support your point, the way I understand it is that the skin needs the red and infrared to heal. While if you look at, and of course we have UV and the visible, which is generating these free radicals, but then you go inside, okay, there's no UV, and people feel safe under, let's say, artificial light, but then you have no infrared inside, and you have no red inside, but you have artificial light. And so, if someone's concerned about their, skin quality, they should probably not be under artificial light, right?
I believe so. I mean, How long is it going to take? As we started talked before, figuring out the relative impact of one thing versus another is difficult because, you know, you have to start thinking about it from the standpoint of, you have all these different wavelengths of light, and and each one of those wavelengths have an associated photon energy, which we call electron volts. And basically what's going on is that those electron volts, those photons that have a certain level of electron volts are capable of doing certain things. And the body is designed under the assumption that we are out in sunlight, in which all the different wavelengths are, all the different energy levels are available in these photons. When you start removing large chunks, and people need, one of the things that I think is the most amazing thing is that we have gone through, or we are in the process of going through the largest reduction in solar exposure in human history. And that has occurred in just a matter of a blink of the eye from the standpoint of evolutionary timescales. In the last 100 years, we started out with, we had sunlight. Everybody was in, they were outside most of the time. Way back when, they didn't even have clothes. They were wandering around, getting exposed to sunlight. So the body adapted to be able to handle that situation. Then we started introducing clothes, then we started introducing fire, then we started introducing incandescent, then we started introducing fluorescence, and then we introduced LEDs. And what's happened is this compression where we've got, instead of having this full exposure running that of all these different photons, different energy levels, that has been compressed down to less than 10% of the solar spectrum. And when you do that, it's not like it's a benefit. It's actually it's a negative from the standpoint you're removing those positive aspects. You mentioned wound healing. Wound healing has been shown to occur everything from, you know, green to out to 2000 nanometers and beyond. So I mean, if you look at, we're not doing what we're doing because it's what makes sense from the standpoint of the biology of the body. We're doing availability. Every time a new light source comes on or a new laser, it's the best thing since sliced bread to deal with collagen to go to 1660 nanometers. It's the best thing, 850 is great, 900. And so you see what they're really doing is that they're actually using the fact that they get a new toy or a new wavelength is our new laser or new whatever. Yeah, you can optimize around a particular wavelength for a particular thing, but you have to be very careful that you're not introducing a negative effect somewhere else. And that's what I think is really going on with a lot of these mitochondrial diseases that we're struggling with. And because we're actually degrading metabolism efficiency. And I think that's what's really coming out of Glenn's work. And Glenn Jeffrey has been doing these series of experiments and starting to publish them, where he literally is showing that an LED causes you to start your color contrast to degrade in your eye. And he's the world's expert on measuring these eye effects. And then he introduced, okay, let's add a 850 in, and I improved a little bit. And now he's introduced incandescent, even in a small amount for a short time. And you see this huge increase in the amount of color contrast improvement in the eye. So, the body's designed to take on or to deal with things in a broad, the entire spectrum. And taking stuff away is just as bad as putting too much in. So, in my opinion.
Exactly, and one other way of thinking about this for the viewer is that we have been designed under one constant sun. So we're using everything. So being under artificial light or deciding to not be outside and not open up a window, for example, would be the equivalent of just removing half of the essential nutrients we need and then going, oh, I'll be fine,
Yeah.
nothing to worry about. So that's, you have to think about, okay, the nutrition and then the light diet. The light diet
Yeah.
has to be on point to be
Well, I
healthy.
mean, it really is the same kind of thing. I mean, it's like telling your viewers that all you should eat is avocados for the rest of your life. I mean, that's going to have a negative effect. That's exactly what we did in lighting. We took out and we took away, threw out everything else, and just provide to the public this very narrow range. And so, what we're doing and why what we make is we basically are trying to get as far out in the spectrum we can get and still meet the government mandates for energy consumption and things of that nature. But it's hard because there's been such a focus on trying to save the world by getting rid of energy, reducing the energy thing, which is sad because it didn't work. I mean, yes, you can buy a light bulb and it can do 8 watts. What ends up happening is that they end up putting more bulbs in, or B, and then putting them outside for security reasons, which is now screwing up the insect population. There was a recent paper talking about they did a study on moths for night pollination. And in one summer, they were able to cut the population of the moths in half just by having streetlights, LED streetlights in the area. So, I mean, there's so many ways that you could come back to the same conclusion that the body, whether it be our body or the insects or whatever, or even the plants, they're they make the assumption that we are exposing them to all these different wavelengths or all these different energy levels or energy bands. And, when we took them away, we essentially have created a situation that degrades our ability to metabolize. And that's why when you see the astronauts coming down from the space station, they look aged and haggard. You see someone coming out, some of the hostages coming out of being in a tunnel for a year. They look really bad. And what we're finding is those are all degraded mitochondria, all those things. And if you take that and you mandate that everybody, you or I will go outside, we'll get some time outside. But if you're someone who's in a nursing home or someone who's in a prison or someone who's, got some disability that makes it very hard, you know, it it's almost really getting kind of frustrating. I mean, if you look at it, the recent stuff that Roger Seaholt did, I don't know if you saw it, but basically what he did is he had a patient who was struggling with COVID and was going to be intubated. And he said, "Can I take you outside just for a little bit?" And he ended up taking the patient with all the oxygen, with all the other stuff out. And it was remarkable. Quickly, all of a sudden, the guy turned around, felt better. There's just more and more of these stories where, something that we used to do in the 1800s is a matter of fact. All the hospitals had balconies where they'd roll the patients out during the day to try and get some sunlight, and it's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward, you know, but we now have designed hospitals where you can't even open a window, and we filter the air. Well, some of the stuff in that air is actually good for you. And, filtering it all out actually it seems to be creating a negative effect. So, I guess I'm just saying, in the simplest form, we have a spectrum that runs from 250 out to 10 microns or beyond, and the body's figured out how to take advantage of it, all the things. One of the things that's been really fun working with Bob Fosbury is that he's an astrophysicist, and we were looking at some of the spectral data, trying to define. Bear in mind, it's really hard to get data out beyond 1,000 nanometers. Okay, it's expensive equipment. Generating that, other than an incandescent source like we use, is very difficult and expensive. So, in general, very little is understood about these longer wavelengths. And they also, what is occurring is we're starting to figure out, in each one of the different functions in the body. You say, take photosynthesis for example. Photosynthesis extracts just the wavelengths that it needs to generate the energy it needs for photosynthesis. It rejects the others. And it does that using some really amazing structures, nanostructures that plants have are extremely efficient at just taking out what they need from the solar spectrum and rejecting the other. And you ask why? Well, you ask why. The reason is that photosynthesis can only occur within a very narrow range of temperatures. So it's dumping out it only uses what it needs, dumps the rest off to us, as I said, walking in the forest, so that you get this amazing synergy or symbiotic nature between plants and humans and animals and insects, who are, like I say, they take out a little bit. But if you look at it from a standpoint of, okay, what's important, the each one of these different processes, photosynthesis, ATP production, immune response, they all are responding to certain bands of energy within the solar spectrum. And when we start chopping off or not allowing those do, and we don't even understand how they work together, you know, there's this really interesting effect that occurred that this gentleman Yakimov showed. And what he showed was is that the outer part of the skin, where UV is coming in and being absorbed and generating vitamin D and all the steroids and cortisol and a number of other things, is only about 50 microns thick. We have this outer layer, 50 microns, where that UV is absorbed. The other place where that same thing occurs is actually in the longer wavelengths beyond 2000, 1500, 1300 nanometers. At that particular wavelength, the water is strongly absorbed. So what happens? You've got trying to generate vitamin D, which is really hard to do and very inefficient. Well, what's happening when we're in sunlight, all of a sudden these longer wavelengths are taking and generating hydrogen peroxide. Okay. So what ends up happening is that in the same layer, you got UV being absorbed, near infrared being absorbed, high density of photons in the infrared component, and generating hydrogen peroxide. If you want to, in order for the efficiency of doing what we do for vitamin D, you end up having to photochemically bleach that region, that 50 microns. It's really hard to photo bleach melanin. It's very resistant to this. But the minute you add hydrogen peroxide to it, all of a sudden it bleaches out. And Yakimov was able to show that the melanin in the outer part of our skin is actually oxidized, and which means that it absorbs less of the UV. So more UV goes in, higher probability of generating vitamin D. So it's not just this one does this one does this. Now we're starting to see that this part is working with this part to actually improve the process altogether. And if you
Wow.
start throwing those away, you get these really negative effects and you can actually see this. There's a picture on the web in the lady from Senegal, and you can actually see the blue, sometimes you call it a blue tinge or halo around someone with really dark skin. That is actually a very thin layer being photochemically bleached in her skin to maximize the probability that she can generate vitamin D, even though she has very dark skin in that area. So to me, it's just the most amazing thing, and the oversimplification that we've gone through here is just amazing to me. It's there's a lot more going on that we don't understand than what we do.
I can see two huge implications of this. I have a private community on school, and because I know how well people progress in there, I'd like to invite you to join. I think it could really, really help you out. It's the first link in the description. So the first one is that if you use a vitamin D lamp indoors with, no windows open, you won't produce vitamin D, or it will at least be much harder. That's one. And then second would be, well, this hydrogen peroxide generation that's bleaching the melanin. Well, that would mean that if you don't get the morning sunlight, no UV and then lots of red, you would not be able to create as much vitamin D then, at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., etc., as you approach noon. So Jesus Christ, now I'm understanding Cruz's work as well. That's very cool.
Yeah, no, but you can go through and you know bear in mind that most of the biological processes in the body have an activation energy. A certain amount of energy is required in order to pop over the barrier height, and that's how we actually control the relative ratios of chemical reactions in the ATP and all these different processes. Now, the majority of those um, processes have you would characterize them in electron volts, which is the energy required to move an electron 1 volt difference. And it's a very small number, but most of the biological processes fall within a range of 1.2 to zero point 0.2 electron volts. Okay. That happens to be exactly where the peak, if you put everything in terms of electron volts, sunlight, you reorganize the bins essentially, and instead of being in terms of watts, you do it in terms of electron volts. You'll find that there's this really amazing phenomenon that occurs in nature or from the sun. And this is one of the things that I found so fascinating working with Bob, is the peak photon. If you look at how many photons, the photon density, they call it photon flux density, as a function of electron volts, it turns out that the peak of the solar spectrum is actually at 0.75 electron volts. And I showed that to Bob because the solar cell industry does this all the time. As we talked from the very beginning, there's all these different energy bands that you're trying to that you're exciting when you're associated with sunlight. Okay, but it turns out that the sun at this 0.75 EV, and it's centered around a range of them. There's what's called a hydrogen minus opacity window. So in those, we're at those energy levels, photons in the sun generated at those energy levels can actually escape from deeper in the solar atmosphere, and that's where you get this spike. Happens to coincide almost perfectly with the average activation energy of almost every biological process in all life forms. So it appears that the infrared, all our processes, that the ATP, where you go in and you go through 4 different stages, and you're essentially pumping electrons down to generate protons. Those are all occurring in energy ranges that coincide with what this spike area, or this increased level of photons. It's not that there's more watts in that area, it's the fact that there's more useful photons available for biological processes in that area. And that's one of the things we're having the great battle over now, is that when you switch over and you start thinking about, I don't care just about whether or not there's a photon there. I care about what energy level that photon is, because it can then transfer its energy into a biological process by moving an electron. Then you start to see how beautiful the system is all set up. And so you've got, like I say, when we're talking about UV, that's 5 electron volts. It's a big number. Lots of energy in every photon. Not very many photons, but lots of energy in every photon. In vision, it drops down into the 4 to 0.2 or to 4 to 2 electron volts. When you get into the infrared, near infrared, then you're starting to talk about 2 electron volts out to 1 to 1.2 or something like that. Then you get into the short wave and the infrared, where all these photons are excess photons are, and that's going from 1.2 to zero point 0.2 electron volts. And it's just this amazing coincidence, I'll say at this point, that sunlight has this window where it generates an excess amount of photons, and then biology is basically coming in and lining up with that. And it looks like it's all kind of like the we kind of developed biology. Most of the biological processes have developed around the concept that have this excess infrared. Now you take it away, you know, and what happens? Still works because you've got some energy from just our surrounding ambient, but it doesn't work as well. And I think at the core of it, that's what Glenn is showing. The minute we start introducing back in these higher energy photon or these infrared and near infrared photons, you get this enhancement in the ability of the body to generate ATP. More ATP ends up being that you have this ability to accelerate wound healing, all these other things. So, it's all kind of starting to come together, I think, in a lot of ways, but it is creating quite a debate going on within the community, I think.
Again, this is why I tell my members and clients, or one of the first questions I ask them is, how much time are you spending outside if they have any kind of, let's say, digestive issue or skin issue? And the reason is because, as you're saying, with near infrared, again, windows block that out, and you're going to get far less of that inside if all the windows are shut than zero, if I've understood it correctly. And if you look at a skin or digestive issue, it's ultimately a lack of energy in that tissue. The tissue is losing energy. So then if you're, eating well, but you're spending all your time inside and, you're depriving, based on your work, if we're talking about an adult, 60% of your cells of a crucial, well, basically the oil of the engine. That's one,
Yeah.
but then also an energy source in general. I mean, you're gonna get issues. You're bound to get issues, especially if you've been doing that for several years, and then let's say sitting in front of a, computer desk under artificial light up, for many years again, which is what most guys and girls are doing in modern society. And then again, they change their diet, but they still have issues. Again, these are the people that come to me. And so that's why when someone in the comments, for example, asks me, "Oh, I have digestive issues. What should I do? I'm eating this and that." I say, go outside more because they are they are for certain not going outside. And then I wanted to ask you, I mean, for me, I've understood that opening up the window is really, really important. Just at least having a little bit. Does that basically bathe the room in near infrared? And how much what wavelengths are the windows taking out? How much red are they removing?
Well, the way most of the new low E glass, they're basically blocking or reflecting back out 700 to around 2000 nanometers. Yeah. And I think one thing, if I could just real quick, one of the problems that we have is that we are so driven by availability of sources, and the intent. There's so much focus on, is it 850? Is it 7830? Is it 1064? Is it not 940? Is it 1270? Is it 1660? And the answer is all the above. And unfortunately, we have this reductionist approach. And I think that's what Glenn is really trying to show. When I started first working with Glenn, he is about the most ethical person I think I've ever met in my life, because he'd started to show that exposure to just blue LEDs had negative effects. So he shut down any experiments on humans associated with blue. And now
Wow.
he's what it then he said, okay, well, let's look at 850 or let's look at 670. And he ran a series of experiments and showed some benefit. Everything he's shown is now is that, and if you ask him, he would say, I just put incandescent into my house because he's finding that there's always something else. Okay. You may get a benefit from 850, but there's always something else that you could get if you were just going back to broadband thermal emitters like what occur in nature. And so, in it's kind of a little confusing, but I'll try and put, if you look at the near infrared, what people talk about photobiomodulation, most of the activities going on in the reds, deep reds, and then say out to maybe 1,000 nanometers. Most of the measurement tools that we have available to us only go out to 1,000 nanometers, if that. You know, you can buy a spectrometer for reasonable amount of money, and you can think you're measuring out to 1,000. Most of them don't really work that well out 1,000, but they do. They claim it. Then but what you got to remember is that that's 1,000 nanometers. We went from 250 to 1,000 nanometers. If you look at the rest of the infrared spectrum, it runs from 1,000 nanometers out to beyond 6,000 nanometers. Some of the bands associated that the astronomers use to look out into the atmosphere in the near infrared are 3 times wider than the entire visible spectrum. Yet we don't talk about it, we don't think about it. Yet that is where the majority of the photons actually are that are of use to the body. And if you try and use higher energy photons like the 670, 850, they are red, they are near infrared, but they are an excess amount of energy that our biology is asking for. And so therefore, in a lot of ways, it's not the optimum. I'm not saying it doesn't do something. I'm just saying it's not the optimum for what the body wants. The body wants those shorter wavelengths, the longer wavelengths that we haven't even talked about in most of the stuff. Those are all blocked by glass, or the low E glass. They don't occur in any of the light sources that any LEDs, OLEDs, compact fluorescent. They do occur in incandescent and halogen sources. They occur in sunlight. They occur in moonlight. They occur in fire. Everything in nature that we are exposed to, and all the stuff predating some of these, um, what I call mitochondrial diseases, all had broadband clear out to 6,000 nanometers. So when we took it all out, when we shrank it, we not only shrank it into a very narrow band that just the eye responds to, we also took away um, what was the optimum energy levels to make biology work its best. And that's, so I don't know if that answers your question, but it basically, you know, we're moving from this visible only, visible plus near infrared, near infrared, visible to with a little UV maybe, and then now we're moving out into the mid infrared and the shortwave infrared, which very little is known. There's not even measurements being made on people's skin characteristics at some of these longer wavelengths. We don't even know. What we do know is that if I take a picture of you in the mid infrared or in the shortwave infrared, your skin is black as black, your hair is white as white, and it is the the because all this stuff that's going on is water. All those longer wavelengths are being absorbed in the water in your body, and so it doesn't matter whether you're black, white, purple, or green. In those longer wavelengths, it's absorbing strongly, and we all have black skin.
Something I think people need to understand also that I learned from your work is that if it's raining, it's cloudy, and you're wearing a bunch of clothes, even then you're getting all the near infrared basically. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Bob's pictures, our Nick Spiker, he did a series of pictures associated with different wavelength ranges. And as you move from visible or UV to visible, the clothes that we're wearing uh, start to uh, transmit more and more. And so by the time they had a camera back, Sony had a camera back a while back, quite a while back, and it looked at the near infrared, let you see. Unfortunately, they had to take it off the market because kids were using it to look through people's clothing. So, so
Jesus Christ.
it's not really. I guess I'm just saying is that we're in this process where developing ways to measure pictures, do pictures in longer wavelengths that you know people don't know because we haven't had the ability to really measure it until lately. And when we do, all of a sudden we start finding out there's all these other things going on.
Man, you threw me off with that camera. That's amazing. I need to get one of those. In any case, um, I think melatonin is a very interesting subject because it seems as though when we're outside, again, getting all this infrared, near infrared, the way I've understood it is that, it helps our mitochondria. It's mitochondrial support. It makes sure that the energy creating process, the electron transport chain, works, that works without us, basically so that the electrical flow in there in the inner mitochondrial membrane is smooth. That's why I liken it to the oil of an engine in a car. But when Dr. Sarah Pugh, a dear friend of mine, asked you about what you think the main function of the near infrared is, you answered that it's it's melatonin production. So if you could talk more about melatonin and near infrared, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I did when I started working with Russ Ritter, he's got 100,000 citations on melatonin, and he's the guru. And we started looking at, well, why is it why is it just at night? Melatonin, the standard lore from circadian is the pineal gland generates melatonin during the night. That's what it causes an increase in your blood supply, and then cortisol comes in and gets suppressed. Melatonin gets suppressed during the morning, and we're alert. Don't disagree with that. That actually happens. It's a part of the body's. It's a baseline. But what we're now showing is that if you take a person at 9 o'clock in the morning and you do exercise, do extensive exercise, and you're monitoring the melatonin level in their blood during the morning for 4 hours. This was the work done by um, Thanos or Theron. And what you see a rapid increase in melatonin in the blood on a transient basis. So there's more what I'd call a steady state melatonin in the body, and then there's a transient response. So what happened? The muscles are sitting there generating all this ATP, and but they also are generating an excess of melatonin. So what happens is that you get this huge spike in melatonin during the day. You do the exercise, it plateaus. Do this exercise for 4 hours, stop the exercise, and then it takes about an hour for the melatonin in the blood to drop back down. So you have to separate out steady state hormone levels or gentle hormone levels that occur on a diurnal basis from transient. So what's going on? Melatonin is being generated anytime you kick up your ATP production. Melatonin is generated in response to that in huge amounts. And the easiest ways to see it, you can see it if you do exercise. You can see it if you do. Think about it this way: if how many times have you come off from the beach and said, "Wow, I'm kind of tired," or how much exercise you did at exercise, and you kind of say, "Gosh, I'm kind of tired after that exercise." what you're actually seeing is the the transient melatonin that's been building up in your system. And it takes a while for that to get out. And because the body always tries to generate an excess of antioxidant versus the things like cortisol. And so now what we're doing is we're starting to see these moving from these diurnal measurements, which make up 99% of the circadian literature. And we're starting to measure at frequency. You think about it, you have a tennis ball in your hand. You take a picture of it. You throw it up, you catch the tennis ball, you take a second picture of it. That's what circadian people have been doing. What happens instead is that when we do life, we do a stressor, we do exercise, we go for a walk, we walk out into the sun, the body has to respond on a time scale of minutes, not hours, not days, minutes. So what ends up happening? You look where what we're seeing is there's a new sweat monitor that we've got out, or that the company is working on, and we've been using, that measures melatonin and cortisol and a couple other cytokines at a rate of every 3 minutes and tracks it. And so what you can start to see is this effect I was talking about with the tennis ball. If your frequencies of sampling are sufficient, all of a sudden you see that they're on top of this diurnal thing is all these little melatonin spikes and that are associated with the body responding to it. And we're measuring sweat. So it basically shows that melatonin is generated in every cell throughout the body in response to the stress level it has. And so, to answer the question, I believe very strongly that the infrared is one of the key producers, one of the key stressors for generating the excess melatonin that we need to deal with all the reactive oxygen species that are being generated. When you don't have the infrared in there, then you have a higher stress level on the ATP production and things of that nature. So
To have great sleep, spend more time outside. Would that be a conclusion one could make?
I guess you could say that. I'm sorry that it gets off into the weeds a little bit, but yeah, you're right. Um,
No, I'm just
it,
summarizing for the viewer. I mean, the way you explain it is wonderful.
no, but I guess yeah. At the end of the day, what you do during the day affects whether or not you sleep well. You know, and all I'm saying is that if you're getting out there and you're generating high levels of melatonin by being outdoors in sunlight and doing exercise and all that, you sleep like a baby. If you don't get outside and you sit inside, staring at a computer monitor all day, and then it gets dark and you're trying to generate, you essentially you're pretty well tapped out on melatonin. You haven't generated this excess. You can almost think about it like a battery. You have every mitochondria has the capability to generate melatonin. I think that's what the data shows very clearly. Okay. Not just the pineal gland. It doesn't mean the pineal gland isn't important. It doesn't mean that we don't have circadian response to that kind of stuff. But your pineal gland is not dealing with things on a minute by minute basis all throughout the day. It's just not, you know. But the minute I do something, I have this huge amount of melatonin that comes into the bloodstream. Where did it come from? Well, it came from the muscles. The muscles cells are generated. They're intimate to the blood plasma to begin with. And so if you can set up a condition where you're measuring at a high enough frequency using biomarkers like sweat or blood, you know, the beautiful thing about the sweat thing is that you don't have to go poke somebody and have them, you know, constantly sampling from their blood. The sweat is basically shows it. I did a quick little, just a more practical thing. I had the sweat monitor on, and my wife and I went out to eat. And you could literally see the cortisol change as the appetizer, main course. And then all of a sudden, as we got towards the end of the meal, there was this huge spike in melatonin. Came out of nowhere. It was only about 20 minutes wide, but it came up, came down, cortisol dropped back down to the baseline. So we've got this system, control system, that's trying to get you to sleep every night. It's got this gentle wave thing that's 24 hours long. But what you do during the day is altering the amount of melatonin that's being generated in the body on a stressor by stressor basis. When you eat, when you do exercise, when you go out in the sunlight, when you do all these things are causing your cells, the mitochondria, to make some excess melatonin. Well, melatonin is a consumable, if and it appears that the body always makes a little bit of excess. Why you have that sleepiness associated with when you're doing things, and, you know, like I say, going outside, whatever. Um, and that excess melatonin is a reservoir for the body. What happens when you hit nighttime? Your cellular activity drops. The pineal gland kicks in, generates some excess melatonin because the brain's still operating at 80% of its capacity anyway. That goes into the excess of that melatonin generated by the pineal goes into the blood supply. We see it as a jump, and it goes out to all the cells that are kind of hurting. And it's a perfect time to efficiently transfer melatonin into a cell that is in not in its best shape. So to mop up some of the reactive oxygen species. So I mean, it's a beautiful system. I mean, you have to look at it and just say, but again, it's coming down to measurement. I'm an engineer at heart. If you can't measure it, there's nothing you can. All the papers out there on circadian that I know of, other than some of Glenn's work and Theron's work, go and sample every 4 hours or 8 hours or a day later or a week later. That's not what's going on here. This stuff is changing on a minute by minute basis. And you think about it, it just has to be logically that way. You, you walk out in the sunshine, you're generating all this reactive oxygen species. I have to wait till nightfall in order for it to get mopped up. No, it actually generates it during the day. And so, and that was really the purpose of the paper I did with Russ. And then we had a series of papers that we showed the transient response to exercise. And now I'm starting to do stuff with the sweat and showing that there truly is a transient response. And it's not just what you see is that the cortisol may go up, melatonin comes up and forces the cortisol back down. So they're yin and yang in their properties. So, getting out, doing a bunch of exercise just bolsters the amount of excess melatonin you have in the system.
And this relationship between the cortisol and the melatonin that you just mentioned is probably why we have so much adrenal fatigue in modern society. There are many causes, but one of them, and this is what I always tell my members, is RF and blue light. Because blue light increases your cortisol, and you have no near infrared that produces the melatonin to balance it out. The sun, again, provides you with blue and so also near infrared, so melatonin. So you're producing cortisol and melatonin at the same time when you're outside, and that keeps everything balanced. But inside, your cortisol will just shoot up and continue being up because you're not producing any melatonin.
I totally agree. I believe we're just creating a generation of cortisol addicts, because it's not just, as we talked, it's not just the blue light. It's the fact that it's a high stimulus, high frequency flashing and associated with flicker, was associated with the refresh rate on your TV, things of that nature. So all those things, everything that we've done in modern society has increased cortisol and decreased melatonin, in my opinion. And there's a really interesting study where they took and measured, took some people that were schizophrenic and clinically depressed and against the control group. And they measured the melatonin to cortisol ratios at midnight. They sampled it at midnight. And there was a factor of 4 difference, higher level of cortisol in the people with schizophrenia and depression compared to the people that were were the control group. And I'm totally convinced that we're creating an environment that tends to always pump up cortisol. I mean, you watch a movie at night, you know, if I had the sweat monitor on and I had it, it was a dark night, and then I decided to watch a movie. All of a sudden, you see cortisol go bam, 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 associated with the time frame that I was watching the movie. Now, that was a 10 lux. It was like no light level whatsoever, but it's the contrast. It's like going around and what's more, nothing more irritating than all the little blue and green little LED lights on all the wall warts. That or your clock having bright light, it doesn't take much. It's the contrast that sets you off. And you think about it from the standpoint of the function of cortisol. What is the function of cortisol? Cortisol is supposed to be your fight or flight response. It's responding to some radical change, either in light levels or noise levels or whatever. You know, the best movies are the ones that have everybody shooting everybody else and running around and all this stuff flashing in front of you. I mean, watch a child. My grandsons, they turn the TV on, they can get locked into that so quick. It's ridiculous. And the point is that why? They're getting locked in because their cortisol is getting pumped. That's what's going on. And there's some interesting studies where there appears that cortisol is tied in with the addiction. And, especially people who are trying to get off of drugs if their cortisol levels are not, the cortisol can be the determiner of what level of their probability of getting off a drug is. So I think that there's so much that we could learn if we start thinking about light as much more than just something to see with and having other effects. So
Now, there's something very, very interesting that I learned in one of your papers, and it is that 60% of the cells in an adult are affected by the near-infrared light, but 100% of the cells in a child or a fetus also are affected by near-infrared. So that leads me to believe that it's extra important. And then I also read that and I quote, preliminary results for the ABCD study indicate that children spending more than 7 hours exposed to artificial visible only light sources exhibited thinning of their cerebral cortex. And then, of course, you talk about cerebrospinal fluid and how it reflects near-infrared light into the brain. So if you could talk about that, that would be wonderful.
yeah, I mean I was surprised when I started doing the models of the body and that there wasn't more work done. One of the big misnomers, if you look at the literature, you see that everybody puts up a little chart that shows that UV goes this amount into the bot skin, this goes a little bit deeper, and the infrared goes into down to maybe into your dermis a little bit. It's a classic picture that's on most of the PBM stuff, and it's wrong. If you look at Bob Fosbury's picture where he went and put 850 nanometer over underneath his hand, and then he took a camera that could see 850, you see the entire hand lights up. The infrared is penetrating inches into the body. Because children are smaller, then a higher percentage of their cells are being engaged by interacting with sunlight than an adult who's bigger. The same even holds true when you go into insects. Insects are eons ahead of us in their usability of light because it has such a huge effect, especially in infrared. thousands of different structures are being generated to do all kinds of things. But to your point is that um, the problem is they don't know how to measure. We are not okay. The example I use is this: is that you take an ice cube, clear ice cube, take a laser, you point the laser through the ice cube, and you have a detector on the other side of the ice cube. You get almost 100% of the light to go to the detector, right? Take and replace that clear ice cube with a snowball, exactly the same dimension. Shine the laser through, you get almost nothing to go through to the detector. When these people are making these measurements, they don't understand that scatter is not absorption. What's going on is that so what they do is they take a laser, they take a sheep's head or a cadaver, they shine a laser through it, and they put a detector on the other side inside the skull, and they don't measure anything. That doesn't tell you anything. It's like if you look at that ice cube or that snowball, when you shine the laser on it, what happened? The entire thing lit up, and that's what's going on. It's scatter, not absorption, and you can't measure it the way they're measuring it. You have to actually put it in some integrating spheres and do a bunch of tough jobs. But it's an unfortunate problem that we have, and you see most. And so what you'll see most people say that infrared only penetrates a millimeter in the body. Glenn just got a paper that published where he went out and showed measuring it properly, showed how much light is actually going through the body, all the way through the body, and how that he jives in with Bob's pictures where he's showing how the entire body's lighting up. So we have to overcome some bad information in the lit uh, in order to really understand that. And it's quite a large wavelength range. It's everywhere from about 650 out to about 1100 nanometer, 1200 nanometers that this effect occurs. And it's really, when you think about it, it's really kind of amazing because what it's doing is it's taking the photon and it's letting it bounce around, scatter all throughout your skin and into your brain, and eventually it finds something to get absorbed because there's very low absorption in that region, but it's a way to kind of distribute, have sunlight on this side of your face, it distributes it throughout the body, the brain, in a lot of ways. So it's actually, quite elegant from an optics standpoint. But,
So, so I drew two conclusions from this. Or there are many conclusions to draw, but the two I'm thinking of is that if you're, let's say, an Icelandic man who's 6'6", you've got less cells being affected by the near infrared as opposed to being, let's say, someone from, let's say, southern Spain who's 5'6", for example. You've got a higher percentage of cells being affected because you have a smaller body. Also, being, let's say, obese, for example, would prevent the light from reaching all your cells, your vital organs, for example, because you have so much, let's say, visceral and subcutaneous fat as well. So then that would be a consequence of that. Yes, so intelligence. So being outside, the cerebrospinal fluid, according to your work, is sort of you're absorbing the light, the sunlight, and then it's being concentrated on the brain so that it gets into the brain, specifically also the gray matter, the folds there. And
yeah.
so the if someone wants to have good brain function, they have to spend time outside. Being inside will lower your IQ. That's something that I,
Well, I mean,
concluded.
and don't take my models for it. Just every study that's been run shows that children learn better in natural sunlight compared to artificial sunlight. That's one of the things that kind of gets me. For whatever reason, we seem to accept that we have all this data that there's an advantage to being in sunlight, but we accept what I would call a toxic light source. You mentioned your blue blockers. Do you wear your blue blockers when you go out and look at the blue sky?
Hell no.
No. it's a ton more blue photons coming through there than there are coming when you're sitting there in front of the TV. So, instead of, I can sit by a campfire at night and I can feel my wife and I love camping and love campfires and stuff like that. You just feel relaxed. You feel the effect. I don't ever think of wearing a blue blocker to look at my campfire, but I would agree that wearing a blue blocker while looking at the same image on my big screen TV, a blue blocker seems to have an effect for some people. And I would argue that because they're not the same blue. And, even campfire has a lot of blue content in it, relative to, it's got more of the infrared, but it's got blue in there. Why don't I need to wear blue blockers there? And so we spend somebody told me there's like $1 billion on blue blockers. You're trying to fix that's so that you can watch something that's toxic. That's what you're really trying to deal with. And, the blue is not the culprit. The blue is not the problem. The lack of infrared is the problem. And, when I watch TV or my wife and I watch TV, we have our lights on or we do incandescents if we don't have that particular style we make yet. And I don't know. I sleep like a baby. All I guess I'm just saying is that it's frustrating that we are shown so many ways, independent, different things. Literally, Glenn is showing enhanced ATP production by adding some red and infrared in. Incandescents are better than the others. And yet we are willing to put our children in that position. I believe that a lot of the hormonal, it's not just melatonin, it's not just cortisol, it's testosterone, it's a lot of other things that should be very concerning to everybody. But we've got this TV that we were very happy with and we watch at the wrong time of day and all this other stuff. And so, but until we understand and people really realize the mechanisms, you can do things, as I said, you can go out in the sun and be responsible, wear a hat, wear some, cover your arms or whatever, and spend all day out in the sun. My grandpa did it and lived into his 90s, and kept his mind the whole time. That is much different than slathering on a bunch of sunscreen or whatever, trying to wear blue blockers or whatever, trying to overcome what shouldn't have been there in the first place. That's the problem.
What I think people should know is that you're actually, you have a company called Nera Lighting, and you're trying to fix this problem in modern society by bringing back, I believe it's full spectrum bulbs, sort of what John Ott did. Of course, I don't know if you
Yeah.
add UV like him or not, but I haven't looked into that. But of course, I mean, I think your products are great, so do talk about them if you can.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, as I said, we go through this process where we went from fire, sunlight to fire to incandescent to fluorescent to LEDs. All we do is a hybrid approach. LEDs are great for generating visible light. They're highly efficient. They do it well. There's not a problem with it. The problem is, and they're not very good at generating infrared. And but the most efficient broadband source is little filament bulbs that we used to have in the flashlights. Just a little grain of wheat filament bulbs. They're almost 100% effective at generating light between 600 and 6,000 nanometers. So they make this broadband incandescent with the LEDs. We put the two of them together in a bulb, and you get the closest match to sunlight that's available on the market. Eventually, I'd like to add some UV back in, but we have to get everything. So people are kind of afraid of UV, but we do it in one bulb, and it's just literally a screw-in bulb, because then I can control the ratio of the two. And I did a lot of work looking at the Black population associated with what they need, and also children is what they need. And so what we do is we provide a balance where we have the incandescent is providing you with about 4.5 optical watts of infrared from 700 out to 6,000. And then the LED provides 1.5 optical watts of visible. And so what do people do? We have a couple of different configurations. We have a one that you put in with wall wart, that converts from 230 to 48 volt DC, zero flicker, and it has a little toggle switch on it, and you can go from having LED plus incandescent for daytime, because we still want to look, we want to see. Like I say, I don't believe blue is bad. It just needs to be in conjunction with the infrared component. And then at night, you flick the switch and it's just incandescent. So you get this nice orange glow associated with it. And so we sell that as a lamp, or we sell it as a retrofit kit if you have a lamp you like. And it's just we provide you with a 48 volt DC bulb, and he gives you those two different things. We also have an AC version, but it's only available in the US because I can't. Uh, the EU is making it very difficult to, because of their energy standards, for me to sell into Europe. And so we'll see how that goes. But, for someone in Europe, you just, all it is a very simple retrofit kit, and you can convert your existing lamp or one of our desk lamps, or buy a lamp you like. And what I'm trying to, if I could just get people to, like Glenn's experiment, to put a desk lamp with one of our bulbs in it where your workstation is, so that you're getting this low level of near infrared component always available to you while you're looking at your screen with all the stuff that goes with that. And put one or two of them on either side and plug it into the wall, and, enjoy. Because what's happening is that the desk lamps then bounce the infrared off the keyboard and all that into your face. So that's what we provide. It's really simple. It's not, and you know, it's the closest, as I said, it's the closest match, because we go clear up to 400 nanometers out to 6,000 nanometers. So, you know, that's what we do.
How would you, let's say in Europe then, how would you, so you buy the desk lamp. How would it be DC then? Because if it's plugged into the wall, then you'd have flicker, wouldn't you?
No, what we have is we have a little wall wart that converts the AC into DC with the
Okay.
low level of flicker characteristics. And so then you go DC. Once you get it into 48 volt, I mean, if you have a better for AC to DC converter, use it. 48 volts. Don't care. Whatever way you want to generate your DC. There's a number of wall warts out there that are pretty decent, that don't have as much problem. Um, again, what we talked about is that, is the effect of EMF, is it EMF directly, or is it EMF generating pulsing light that's causing a lot of people problem? I would argue pulsing light is more important, but that's just me.
I'll tell you a
But
story from a member. So, of course, we try to fix, or I fix everybody's light environment as well as possible over there, of course. It's non-negotiable. If you're under artificial light, yeah, I'll run after you with a stick. But at least at night, and for extended periods of time. But so he was using his phone with a filter on and with glasses, so he was protecting his skin and his eyes. And he felt like he had trouble going to sleep afterward. He felt like his cortisol was higher, sort of. And then he asked me, could that have been because of the flicker? Told him, yeah, absolutely. It was definitely the flicker. So, so even if you fix the blue light issue, using the phone, as long as it's not DC dimmed, is gonna be a huge issue because of the flicker. And I mean, you used to work on display types, etc., and PVM dimming. So if you could explain that, and also if you have any product recommendations, what phone you use, for example.
Well, I think it's hard I mean, we did is we looked at um, what happens in nature again. And if you look at nature, the maximum frequency that you get exposed to, other than uh, crisis, is about 1 hertz. Leaves flicker, the things that, so it's a low frequency variation that the body seems to not have a problem with. But then if you start looking at what's been going on in the industry, they've been introducing more and more high frequencies, where it's 60 hertz, 120 hertz, 1,000 hertz. And so we designed our DC bulb basically to be just that, zero flicker, because it's, whatever's coming out of the wall wart is whatever's doing, and it's pretty low. I can't even measure it in a lot of cases. So, that part for the DC is pretty straightforward. For the AC, everybody kept on pushing me to do an AC bulb version. It's a little bit more complicated because you have to filter out the 60 hertz. You got to filter out a lot of stuff in the bulb. And we've got it down to about 2% during the thing. But think about it also a little bit of just perspective. For over 150 years, we've had incandescent bulbs that have been run on 60 hertz. They have 15% flicker on AC. Okay. So is it, I believe that there's a difference between blue flicker and red flicker. So, our point is that, if you've got, if we got through all these years with an incandescent without having some of the problems we're having now, then most likely it's more of a function that we have a lot of high frequency blue and greens and yellows and things of that nature that are much more problematic than the effect of the longer wavelengths. So I don't know. I don't use any LED bulbs on the market because they all have some level of flicker in them. Ours, we tried to get it down as far as we could. But again, it's only available in the US because it's 120 volt standard. So over in Europe, the only thing I can sell you is essentially a DC version, which is the one I prefer anyway. And, you know, and you can, like I say, with the retrofit kit, you can put it in, screw in into multiple outlets and things of that nature. It can do up to 6 bulbs at once. And so, there's lots of ways to skin the cat and get rid of it. But I think the biggest thing is that getting the industry has been pushing the frequency, the pulse width modulation. And the pulse width modulation, of course, is turning the LEDs turn on and off very fast. So what most of the industry has been doing is going to higher and higher frequency. And if I think of Philips Hue, I think they said 1,000 hertz is what their flicker-free version is. Because if you get up fast enough, then supposedly the eye doesn't respond. But as I told you at the start of this whole thing, we know that the cell wall potential is responding to kilohertz on a single cell. Professor Peter Light did the experiments. He actually measured on a single cell the effect on the voltage on the potential on the cell wall as a function of being exposed to blue light and white light. And you could see very, very clearly that the cells, while your eye may not respond to 1,000 hertz, your cell walls are. So, I don't think there's a good argument for using higher and higher frequency. They did this with the fluorescence way back when. You'll remember they went to 10,000 hertz, to get to the point. And even then, there's people that felt like if they walked into a fluorescent room or whatever, they were felt agitated. So it's a matter of degree, I guess. But um, our position is that well, we have to minimize it as much as possible because especially in the blue or shorter wavelengths.
I mean, for me, I mean, I think of it as taking care of the lighting and then also taking care of the devices. And I guess with the lighting, one has more options. Like for example, you're providing people with flicker-free bulbs, etc. But with devices, that's just, we're at the mercy of the technology companies, really. So, I mean that I have found some phones that are sort of use DC dimming, but it's still not optimal. So what you have to do is basically use LCD and avoid the OLEDs. The OLEDs are the worst, I should say. Um,
Yeah, I think that we're again, it probably is a combination of what's the action level that's going on in the TV versus and then in the phone compared to the amount of exposure. Unfortunately, what's been going on is as technology advances, the OLEDs and the LCDs, even them, they've been getting bigger and brighter. So in a lot of places, your TV is your light source in most rooms anymore, because it's just so bright and so high contrast. It is this trade-off between comfort and usability and health
of
in a
course,
lot of ways.
of course. In your paper, there's the section about melanin and babies, and I quote. It is interesting that in melanin-rich babies, pigmentation levels can take up to 6 months to reach their adult values after birth. One possibility being that the importance of near-infrared in the womb has been underestimated and that melanin levels are suppressed in the womb to maximize near-infrared exposure until birth, which is absolutely amazing. And then also, it tells you that dark-skinned people not only need more UV, they also need more near infrared.
Very much. I had a friend, he's from Ghana originally, so very dark skin, and he let me do some transmission characteristics. And what it was fascinating is that clearly in the visible there's a transmission difference because melanin the levels are much higher. And so I had another friend who's about as white as you can be. He's red hair Irish. So we had this comparison that we did. And what was fascinating is that as melanin is a very unique material. If I were to take carbon black or whatever, and they put it on your skin or whatever, and replace melanin with carbon black, then it would absorb all the way out into the infrared very strongly. Melanin doesn't do that. Melanin actually is very strong absorption in the UV, drops down, and then it plummets so that it has almost very little absorption throughout this near infrared section. And then it comes back in the longer wavelengths and in a very interesting way. But the point being is that if you go and you look at it from transmission through the body, or some of Bob's pictures work, is that someone with very dark skin and someone with very white skin, their absorptions are like this. And then as you get out to about 800 to 900 nanometers in the infrared, they meet up and they have the same transmission characteristics in the longer wavelengths. And then if you go on out further into the short wave, as I said, we all have exactly the same. We're all black skin with white hair, and uh, and there's no difference at the long wavelengths, which happens to be the same place where all our biological energy levels of all the energy bands that are important. for biological processes. So it's an extremely elegant thing. And what's also really amazing to me, my kind of my pet thing I'm trying to work on and understand is a structure. Because if you look at the plants, they have a periodic structure built into every leaf that is almost identical to what we do when we do telecommunications, where they make a periodic structures to make bag gratings and reflect certain wavelengths. Well, now you think about melanin. Melanin has a particle size of 30 nanometers. Perfect, the diameter that I would need in order to operate. It's a quantum dot in the infrared, and so there's a amazing possibility. One of the things that I'm always amazed with, nature can generate structures we couldn't even dream about making. You look at a diatom, you look at the feathers on a blue jay, you look at um, basically, any color that you see in nature. It's not made by dyes, it's made up by structure. All kinds of different holes. The holes are in the right space at the right time. Now, blue jay doesn't have any blue dye in it for its wing. It's all based on the structure in the feather itself. So, it appears that nature has been, there's all this entire new world that we're coming into where structures are built. If you look at the mitochondria, the cristae, it's got a certain periodicity to it. You look at the reticulum, it's got a periodicity to it. When you start looking at it from that viewpoint, you have all these different structures that the body has gone to great lengths to build that localize photons in a particular place and not in another place. So much to learn. It's really quite fascinating.
Amazing. Um, I wanted to ask about so of course, infrared isn't just heat. People associate it with heat, but the way I understand it is that people at higher latitudes, well, especially in Scandinavia, they do more saunas, they do more hot baths, etc. And that's at a time of the year where the sun is weaker. And so you could almost see it as a compensation. Um, and so
Oh,
the
I think it
question,
is. I
so
think
you,
it very much is. And what's amazing is that if you look at it from a standpoint, just generally, we have sunlight that comes in, starts up in the UV, comes into these longer wavelengths. Your body, just your body by itself, goes up and overlaps with sunlight slightly in this longer wavelengths. So, and then your surroundings. And so I would argue that, and so this is associated with temperature, okay? This is associated with photons from the sun. They kind of overlap. When you get into a sauna, what are you doing? You're essentially pushing the temperature that you're exposed to up a little bit. So you got a little bit more overlap with what sunlight is. So you're providing some energy bands that are not available. I would argue that saunas are a great thing during the winter. You're starved for those longer wavelengths or those shorter wavelengths, and it's just going to make things work a little bit better. I mean, really, at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. The more energy that you can provide from external sources within reason, the more efficiently ATP is produced within reason, and all these other things that are going on. You know, what happens when the body is fighting, the immune system is fighting? It raises the temperature of the body slightly. ATP production increases, immune T cell velocity increases. You know, all we're talking about here is different ways of getting energy into the body that it can use to operate more efficiently. And at some point, you go too far and you burn somebody or whatever. But all that is that the body has developed, it assumes that it's exposed to broadband thermal emissions. I mean, you can go down and there's life down at the vents in the bottom of the ocean that are taking advantage of the heat, the photons being generated from the heat of the lava coming up into the water. In fact, some people would argue that's how we got our start in life, type thing. But, your body, like I say, when you get a cold or you're fighting something, it raises its temperature, activates a bunch of proteins, heat sensing proteins. It does a bunch of stuff. But at its most fundamental level, it's shifting the available energy band farther and farther up towards the sunlight. And, sunlight is different in that it's if you take too much of the UV and the visible, it's got enough energy that it can break bonds, so therefore it can be detrimental, generating reactive oxygen species. That's where melatonin comes into play. But the other way coming up, getting in a sauna during the winter, I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, what do they say? There's more saunas in Finland than there are people or something. I don't know, but it's a good thing, you know. And what I think Glenn's stuff is really showing is you don't have to do it every day, all day. The body kind of it's got this battery, you get charged up and it's got a discharge time. The problem is that people nowadays, they're, they don't have a lot of options. If all the lighting's gone to LED, if all the windows are blocking the infrared component, then you may say, well, I'll get outside, I'm a little run, I'll do some exercise, but you don't. And you're stuck instead in this environment that is, you said, pumping up cortisol and and constantly and not generating a lot of excess melatonin because everything in the data shows that melatonin is the body appears to always be making an excess. Whatever the event is, it makes enough to get the thing done, but it also has kind of a tail associated with it. So.
One of the things I learned from Dr. Jack Cruz is that our fourth complex in the inner mitochondrial membrane, cytochrome C oxidase, absorbs near infrared, and that helps with water production. And so, well, based on where we find near infrared, and based on the fact that we don't have it inside, it would seem as though even hydration is affected by us being outside or us being exposed to sufficient amounts of near infrared. Would you say that this is something you found as well?
Well, I guess, when we climbed out of the ocean, we brought along our water with us, and yeah, I mean, I always find it fascinating that they have all these cells, and then surrounding these cells, there's this interstitial water that's associated with, and then inside the cells, the intercellular water. So I guess I'd say, to me, I look at it from an optics standpoint. I've got this matrix of water with a little bit of lipids floating around inside it in some ways, not quite floating around, but integrated into it. And it's all held together. And so how light propagates through that is just to me is fascinating because, as Jack would say, or I think uh, Pollock talks about bound water and easy water and all that other stuff. But this interstitial water is in some ways an optical guide and part of the scattering effect that Bob sees in his pictures. So I don't know. I mean, whether or not we obviously sweat associated with getting rid of some of the excess water and then replacing it. And that's what I'm measuring when I'm doing these experiments I'm doing. So I don't know. I don't know how to respond to, you're asking, is it enhancing the,
Yeah, well, perhaps if you had read anything, because you know a lot about the literature of well the health benefits of near infrared. So if this is something you stumbled upon, perhaps that the function of complex 4 is enhanced, and so being outside as opposed to inside helps us create more water, which is of course very important health-wise.
Yeah, I guess I think there's been this hunt for the chromophore. It's kind of the reductionist thing. What's the magic thing? And if you look at cytochrome C, it has a little bit of a peak in the 800 region, but not much. And I would argue that it's really water that we should be looking at as the chromophore and itself. And especially when you get it in some kind of bound condition with lipids or things like that. Um, I guess that's where I come from. I can guarantee you that water is the chromophore once you get past the 1200 nanometers because it absorbs like gangbusters in that region. And it's how you get this densification of energy or photons in such a narrow band that's then be used by the UV portion, in my opinion. But no, I mean, like I say, Glenn and Bob in particular, they spent years looking for the perfect chromophore. And I don't think that's what's going on. You need broadband absorption, and water does it ideally. And, you know, and then you start looking at the ratios between water absorption and fat absorption. And I think your point about, people who have a lot of belly fat, you know, myself included, it has a negative effect on how it couples in. So I roll over and I so let it shine on my back instead. So,
Good way to get it
yeah, that is
absorbed.
one thing though that I think that is really fascinating about this whole thing is that one of the things that comes out of Glenn's work is that um, you don't need to expose the entire body. People don't need to go out and run around naked. Glenn's experiment was only an area about that big, where he put the 670 nanometers onto the skin of the and measured their glucose levels on their body. And it appears that when you have a certain level of exposure, essentially the rest of the body, the mitochondria and the rest of the body appear to be responding. So there's kind of like some intelligence. Everybody thinks of these mitochondria as just little power stations, but they're power stations that appear to be talking to each other. And that I think could be really exciting. And it can be the opposite, the negative effect as well, from a standpoint if you're not getting anything, and then the rest of the mitochondria go into kind of like a dormant state, are not doing as much as they should, maybe. I don't know. But at the end of the day, we have a crisis, in my opinion, of mitochondrial diseases, and we're creating them. I'm not as big a fan of food and nutrition as most because I think there's thousands of diets that people have survived on for a long time, millions of years. I mean, I'm not saying you want to eat garbage, but it's not for whatever reason, sunlight is never on the list. You look at the blue zones and what they talk about as being important. They don't seem to mention that that's like the ideal sunlight condition with the plants around him and all this other stuff or reflective surfaces that are kicking it out. And I don't know why. I guess it's just because people take it for granted that sunlight is there. And I, for the life of me, I don't understand why it isn't the number one area for research because it's you know it represents the largest energy represented the largest energy input into the body of bar none. 3 or 4 times that of food. So now you took it away and we don't care. I don't understand that.
Yeah, as I usually say, the absolute healthiest food is sunlight. It's the perfect food.
Yeah, and yeah, And I represent a generation that got hit hardest, I think, in some ways. We had fluorescence, we had all these TVs coming into the forefront. Your generation and the generation after that, I think they're starting to get smarter about it. I mean, I see more and more people looking at getting outdoors, you know. So a lot of work going into, trying to understand, I guess, that there wasn't before. Um, but I did have the advantage growing up that I didn't have the food additives. I didn't have, we did spend a lot more time outdoors. Air conditioning was not normal in a lot of places. So, you know, and I think that people, one of the things that I was found the most very fascinating is that it's not just direct sunlight. Every morning when we wake up, the UV component, UVC, generates a level, it starts an increase in hydrogen peroxide and ozone at the surface of the Earth. And it peaks around 1 or 2. And the levels it reaches is about 5 to 10 parts per billion, which is germicidal levels. So sunlight is creating the hydrogen and peroxide in the ozone, and it's a diurnal effect, almost the exact opposite of sleep circadian. And it goes up 1 o'clock, then drops down. Then what happens is that there's a release of nitric oxide from all the microbes in the skin or in the dirt that we live. So when you're sitting out there laying outdoors and in the fresh air, you're getting this Lysol, being essentially you're breathing it in at a very low level that is bound to have an effect on the microbes that are in your lungs, number one. And then number two, when you go to sleep, lay down next on a sleeping bag or whatever outside, there's a general release of nitric oxide that peaks up during the morning or during the middle of the night, and by morning it goes down. So there's direct and indirect benefits associated with sunlight and fresh air. And that's why I'm kind of against all this indoor air quality garbage, because I think that what they're doing is they're stripping. The best ways to strip out any reactive oxygen species is to put air conditioning in, you know. And there was this during COVID, there was this, for the first time that I know of, there was a biannual flu or COVID outbreak. It happened during the normal time, seasonality, and I did a paper on it. And but then if you look at those states that had air conditionings like Texas, they had another increase in COVID deaths during the summer months when they were indoors in the air conditioning. The place that didn't have that same jump was Italy, where they just opened the windows. They don't have air conditioning. So a lot of it's common sense, I think.
Exactly. So if anyone's in the car driving, roll down the windows. Don't play with
Yep.
air conditioning.
Yeah. I mean, this one guy, Rudnick, I think his name, he did a series of studies where all he did was put in cross ventilation windows at clinics fighting with or trying to treat people with TB. And it had a dramatic effect or impact on just having some cross ventilation to moving not getting uh, people sick by going to the doctor's office. So,
Wow.
I mean,
Um, let's see here. How can people find you? Where can people find your articles or papers, I should say? How can people support you?
well, I mean, if they want to buy a little DC lamp, buy a DC lamp, I'd be very appreciative. Um, if they want to, our company is niralighting.com, NIRA lighting.com. And you can buy a desk lamp. If you're doing it in Europe, please just buy something, buy the DC one, not the AC. Um, and yeah, most of those stuff I published several papers, a couple another another couple with Russ, and then I published a few places you can look under my name. But most of my postings now is LinkedIn. I'll be quite honest, between podcasts and LinkedIn, it's much more effective conversation than publishing papers. Not that there's not a benefit to peer review or whatever, but I find that I get beat up more on LinkedIn than I do on peer reviewing. So I'm kind of a found it to be quite helpful. So,
Well,
even though sometimes I don't like some of the comments that come back, but hey, you
that's the
know,
way it is. For anyone who posts
yeah,
on the internet.
yeah, I know. It's just and then with AI coming in, who knows who's responding,
Oh,
you
exactly.
know.
Well,
But I do appreciate the chance to talk on your podcast because most of the interest has come from people like you, and we're slowly trying to ramp it up. My end goal in this whole thing is to try and get to the point we understand the mechanisms enough where we can try and generate things like that are more advantageous for people in hospitals and that type of stuff, dealing with cancer. I mean, the body has an amazing ability to heal itself if we give it the opportunity. Unfortunately, I think most of the hospitals nowadays are actually the worst place you can go to get well. And I think they're trying to change that, but it's crazy. We know a lot of stuff they think you've been doing that doesn't cost a lot of money. Few conservatories around, you know, go out for a little walk, bring some fresh air into the ventilation system, change the lighting, turn off the lights. That's a good thing.
with that said, thank you, sir.
Thank you.